Well, thank you very much again for the invitation and for letting me participate in this thinking about the intertwinement between Stein and Husserl, and also, of course, about this new edition of Ideas 2. And what I would like to share with you in this presentation is first of all, a very simple observation that then I believe may raise larger questions, larger philosophical questions. So the relatively simple observation is that we see a real difference between how and to what extent values and valuing are treated in the two different editions. So the one edited mostly by Stein, and now the new so-called Urtext. So I'm going to give you some examples of passages that you can find in the Urtext. I have here the German citations, but I will talk about them in English. But if there are any questions later about the text, of course, please feel free to ask. So if we take as the first of Husserl's attempts, the so-called Bleistift manuscript of 1912, we find passages that, of course, we also know from the already existing edition. Husserl talks about the person's surrounding world, the Umwelt, as a world that, of course, includes values. So he talks about a practical Umwelt, practical surrounding world, and also a surrounding world of values. He doesn't say much more in these passages. So it's kind of mentioned in passing without going into any further details about how these values might be constituted, what role they play, and so on and so forth. We do find, this is now on page 44 of the Bleistift manuscript, we do find some allusions to what we find in other texts by Husserl about the relation between feelings and values, which are, of course, indications of how Husserl thought that values are constituted in the first place, as particular correlates of feelings. So he's talking in these kinds of passages in the Bleistift manuscript about sensual feelings, feelings of pleasure, pain, Wohlbehagen, Missbehagen, so a kind of pleasant feeling, a kind of unpleasant feeling, but not necessarily. He's also talking about körperliche Verstimmungen, so a kind of off feeling in a bodily way. So he's trying to talk about this dimension, not necessarily in terms of targeted, very clear conscious feelings, but also in this more diffuse way. And then indeed, in this passage, for example, he does mention that this has to do with the constitution of values, for which he says, and this is also a kind of well-known phrase that he also uses in other texts, a constitution of values for which feelings play a kind of analog role as the matter or Hülle, in his language of ideas 1, are intentional correlates. So he's working on a parallel. It's also a very common figure, between the constitution of perceptual objects on the one hand and the constitution of value objects on the other. And he's sort of saying in a relatively vague way that feelings here play an analogous role as sensations play, for example, in the constitution of perceptual objects. And here again, he's trying to use a very broad understanding of feelings. So here at the end of this passage, he's also talking about feelings of tension, of relaxation. Yeah, so it seems that he is at least reflecting on sort of a broader affective dimension that might play a role here. So this is the second mentioning of values and valuing in the Bleistift manuscript. Yeah, and then we find what we also know already through Stein's edition and through other texts, that somehow Husserl thinks that even value objects of higher levels, so for example artworks, that somehow the value or the constitution of their evaluative dimension ultimately is always referred back to Leiblichkeit, to the lived body. But again, we don't find more details in these passages. Here, I'm also giving page numbers on these slides, not only so that you could, if you wanted, check these quotes, but also to show you the gap between the pages. Yeah, so here we were on page 54, then there's really nothing until page 160, where he's talking about values with regarding to the sciences. So he's talking about, and it's already in 1912 anticipating arguments that we know from the crisis. He's talking in this context about the technical age and the century of technical success. And then he's criticizing the sciences, the empirical sciences, for creating true propositions without insights. So, and in this context, he's talking about insights as Selbstwerte, as themselves somehow values that then also flow into higher activities of evaluative and practical reason. Yeah. So, but again, I'm giving you more or less the whole passage. We don't get a whole lot more. As I said, in this context, Husserl talks about the sciences. It's extremely interesting text, but doesn't say a lot at all about how we're supposed to think about values in terms, especially in terms of their constitution. And I mean, the question, if we go with this motif that value constitution is supposed to have something to do with feeling, with the affective dimension of human life, and with embodiment, then it becomes a very interesting question about, insights as values, and what how we can actually connect these different relatively abstract observations that he makes here. Then, so that actually is already it, what we find in the Bleistift manuscript. So this is part of my point. We find very, very little. Then if you look into the Harp letters, so we're just barely talking a year later. Here we find, on the early pages of the Harp letter, again mentioning of the Gemüts- and Willenssphäre, of the affective dimension and cognitive dimension of conscious life. He's talking about feelings, also about drives. So this brings in an interesting, possible illusion to something that we could think about a whole lot more. But again, it is left at this stage. And then we find the passage that we also already know from the existing Stein's edition of Ideas 2. Here now, really in terms of the person. So when Husserl really wants to get into, so this is section 3 of the Harp letter, which is an entire section on das Wesen der personalen Subjektivität. So he's talking about personal subjectivity on that level. Again, that brings up this talk about the surrounding world, the person as a not only presenting, but also feeling, evaluating, striving, acting person. No? So it's a kind of very holistic idea. And he's talking about, which is of course very important for his notion of reason. The point is that we as persons have at least the ideal capability to reflect on our evaluations, but also on our feelings, even on our drives, etc., etc. But again, how exactly valuing is happening, how values are constituted, and so on and so forth. We don't get a whole lot more about that. We get a little bit more in a Beilage that was written 10 years later. So you see already that Husserl is, this is something that is challenging for him. Clearly, he's struggling with it. He's coming back to it years later. Here you find it's a very nice passage. He's talking about, he's using the example of appreciating an old violin, an Amati violin, so, kind of like older than a Stradivari, yeah. And here you get motifs that we know from his genetic phenomenology, even his generative phenomenology. So the idea that, we don't come to an object like that as if for the first time. So value constitution has a personal history, has to do with habits, but also has a social context. So the sensuous feelings that are constitutively connected with valuing are not always actual feelings or in the sense of occurrent feelings, but we also have here these ideas of sedimentation and so on and so forth that we know from his other works. And then as a last example, die Umarbeitung des Bleistiftmanuskripts. So again, a couple years later, 1 to 2 years later, here we find passages about the attitudes, which of course we also know from Stein's edition of Ideas 2, kind of parallel that Husserl sees between the theoretical attitude and the valuing or practical attitude. And here he gives, a bit of an insight as to how he's thinking about value constitution at the time. But it's relatively simple, quite abstract. He's talking about objects exerting an allure. So this is also the question that we know from the passive synthesis lectures, for example. Yeah. And the allure, the Reiz exerted by the object is then responded to with by the subject in either theoretical, practical, or axiological attitude, and so on and so forth. But again, we don't get more about that here. What is interesting in the Umarbeitung, and this is something that Emanuele Caminada already talked about in much more detail yesterday, is that we get more formulations about intersubjective evaluating, so more explicit passages. So the passage I just showed you that used the violin, the valuable violin that we might appreciate without perhaps even having heard ever the sound of that very violin. Yeah, so it's a very socially complex evaluating, but Husserl also very explicitly talks about intersubjective wishes, intersubjective valuing Gemeinschaftswerte, common goods, etc., etc., and this plays a role then in his ideas of Gemeingeist. Now, when we look at valuing in Edith Stein's edition, we get a very different impression from the start. Yeah, so here, page 7 already has one of the central passages about valuing. So yeah, already on the very early pages, we find this idea, and here Edith Stein is making use of Husserl's idea of correlation. Yeah, and she's talking about evaluating acts that can be very broadly understood as acts of gefallen and misfallen. So what's that in English? Liking and disliking. And that it has to do with the Gemütssphäre, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so she's putting that relatively early already center stage. And here, this is only page 9. And you see it's very bold already, yeah, even if you can't see all the words. But here she is actually including a passage that is supposed to let the reader in on the very first pages of Ideas 2, how we are supposed to think, yeah, about the constitution of values. Yeah, so it doesn't just mention them or talks about the role of them or, you know, says that they belong into the personal sphere and have to do with the surrounding world and so on and so forth. But she's actually using here a passage that is supposed to give the reader a much more in-depth idea of what valuing is about and what value constitution is about. And what you do find in this passage is this, yeah, old and problematic idea in Husserl that we have to do with different strata, with different layers. So in this passage that she's using at this place, it's a passage that talks about, you know, the bloße Sache as the simplest object constitution. Yeah, if you like the talk about levels, deeper or higher levels, I'm already indicating that I find it problematic, but of course it is there in Husserl strongly as an idea, and here you find it too. Bloße Sache as sort of the lower level. And then higher levels of constitution that involve then also a kind of Werterfassung, an apprehension of value, and a constitution of value. Again, connected to the Gemütssphäre, so the affective dimension of conscious life. And here we also find mention of a term that is central to Husserl's parallelization between, on the one hand, you could say cognitive, especially perceptual consciousness, and evaluative consciousness on the other hand. So this idea of Wertnehmung, value taking, in parallel to or in analogy to Wahrnehmung. So Wertnehmung, Wahrnehmung, this idea plays an important role in Husserl's reflection on this supposed parallel between the attitudes and also between the structures of constitution. And here very explicitly again connected to feelings, and here the example is genießen, to enjoy something. But also a little bit of an illusion, although it's not very explicit, but the term Wertnehmung also suggests, for those who are thinking about it already, yeah, a kind of difference between a kind of more passive and active involvement in value constitution, but that's left here at this level. So I'm not going through the old edition, Stein's edition of Ideas 2, because that would take far too long, but I think you already get my point, the simple point that I'm sharing you, or the observation that I'm sharing here with you, that I find it really striking that in terms of valuing and value, the two editions, or the edition and the different urtexts or drafts that we have by Husserl seem to differ significantly. Now, in this passage that you see here on this slide, Edith Stein is including this reference, and I don't know, when I hear it in Edith Stein's voice, I'm hearing it with a kind of impatient tone of voice. But she's here saying, in place of Husserl, of course, who's thought to be the author, she's saying, I already referred to this decades ago in my lectures, right? So den Ausdruck Wertnehmung, den ich schon vor Jahrzehnten in Vorlesungen verwendet habe. Yeah, so if we read it in Husserl's voice, then it's just a reference. Yeah, and he's expecting us to, of course, have read his lecture courses or to have been there. But if we read it in Stein's voice, at least when I read it in Stein's voice, I also hear an impatience here, because indeed we do find much more than we find in Husserl's drafts of Ideas 2 about valuing and value already in earlier lectures. And also we don't have to go to lectures that have a theme that sounds like there will be a lot about values in them. So, for example, if you look at the lecture course on Logik und allgemeine Wissenschaftstheorie, Göttingen lecture course from 1910-11, so that's in Husserliana 30 and was just translated by Claire Ortiz Hill. So it's also become, of the collected works, the English collected works, a volume. So if you look at these lectures that, the theme doesn't sound, there will be a lot about value in there, but there you find all of, you find entire sections on Wertnehmung and value constitution and so on and so forth. Yeah. So, of course, this is purely speculative. I'm not claiming that, I cannot know that Edith Stein put this reference in there for this or that reason, but I can't help but hear a kind of impatience, in particular because Edith Stein didn't just know the lecture courses. She also knew a lot of the material that is now that was just published as volume 43, or the second volume of volume 43, so Studien zur Struktur des Bewusstseins. The second volume contains reflections, I think 551 printed pages, reflections on feeling and value, spanning the years 1909 to 1925 at least. And it's not a good, I would say, volume to look at if what you want to find is Husserl's definitive notion of value or value constitution. But if you're interested in seeing him struggle, it's a very good volume to read. He's clearly dissatisfied with early accounts of valuing, and focused reflections on valuing also lead him to question some of the more established parameters of his own work. So we find in these texts, a strong aspect is this thinking about passive and active dimensions of valuing, but also, how can we think about authenticity in this regard? Are there authentic, inauthentic feelings? And then very self-critical reflections, for example, on the distinction that we know from logical investigations on objectifying and non-objectifying acts, on the very strata model that we still find also in Stein's edition of Ideas 2. So it does seem that he actually increasingly finds that there are more, that the issue of valuing is raising more questions than he's able to answer. And it is at least, if we think of Stein empathetically, then it's not difficult to imagine that she is very impatient with his, continuous struggle in this regard, which of course then will raise larger philosophical questions about, and these are questions that in this presentation I cannot answer. I can only open them up. But questions like, for example, what happens when we talk about valuing and value constitution and values, not in the personal or personalistic attitude that is set up in Ideas 2, but if it becomes part of and transcendental analysis of constitution, then the big question about the strata model of consciousness, I mean, in a way, the core suggests a different image than layers or strata, and a core gives a more concentric kind of metaphor or image. So, these are questions we can raise also with regards to, in this respect, here with directed at the example of valuing, but also in general, a question that we can ask about certain notions or accounts that seem very similar, what we find in Husserl and what we find in Stein. But then, of course, the bigger philosophical question is, what are the different systematic contexts? What are the different roles that the terms play and the concepts play, and so on and so forth. So I'm only, this is in a way only a preliminary, but I wanted to share with you how much it struck me that there was such a difference in the different texts. So thank you for your attention.